The Annual Meeting, June 12, 1906. The annual meeting of the First Church of Christ Scientist in Boston was held in the extension of the Mother Church, Tuesday, June 12, at 10 o'clock in the forenoon. And in order to accommodate those who could not gain admittance at that hour, a second session was held at 2 o'clock in the afternoon. The meeting was opened by the President, Reverend William P. Mackenzie, who read from the Bible and Science and Health as follows. The Bible, Isaiah 54, verses 1 to 5, 10 to 15, and 17, and Revelation 19, verses 1 and 6 to 9. From Science and Health, page 571, line 22, to the end of the paragraph. Page 574, lines 3 to 16, and line 27. And 577, line 4 to the end of the paragraph. Then followed a short silent prayer and the audible repetition of the Lord's Prayer, in which all joined. The following list of officers for the ensuing year was read by the clerk. President, Willis F. Gross, CSB. Treasurer, Stephen A. Chase, CSD. Clerk, William B. Johnson, CSD. In introducing the new president, Mr. Mackenzie said, "When I introduce the incoming president, my modest task will be ended. You will allow me, however, the privilege of saying a few words of reminder and prophecy. My thoughts revert to a former occasion when it was my pleasant duty to preside at an annual meeting when our pastor emeritus, Mrs. Eddy, was present. We remember her graciousness and dignity. We recall the harmonious tones of her gentle voice. Our hearts were thrilled by her compassion, and the memory lives with us. But even more distinctly, may we realize her presence with us today. Why? Because our own growth in love and unity enables us to comprehend better the strength and beauty of her character. Moreover, this completed extension of the Mother Church is an evidence to us of her hospitable love. She has desired for years to have her church able to give more adequate reception to those who hunger and thirst after practical righteousness. And we are sure that now the branch churches of the Mother Church will also enlarge their hospitality, so that these seekers everywhere may be satisfied. This will imply the subsidence of criticism among workers. It may even imply that some who have been peace breakers shall willingly enter into the blessedness of peacemakers. Nothing will be lost, however, by those who relinquish their cherished resentments, forsake animosity, and abandon their strongholds of rivalry. Through rivalries among leaders, Christendom became divided into warring sects. But the demand of this age is for peacemaking, so that Christianity may more widely reassert its pristine power to bring health and a cure to pain-racked and sorrow-worn humanity." Quote, "The wisdom that is from above is first pure, then peaceable. And the fruit of righteousness is sown in peace of them that make peace. Blessed are the peacemakers, for they shall be called the children of God." End quote. Our leader, Mrs. Eddy, has presented to the world the ideal of Christianity, because she is an exact metaphysician. She has illustrated what the poet perceived when he said, "All's love, but all's law." She has obeyed the divine principle, love, without regrets and without resistance. Human sense often rebels against law. Hence the proverb, dura lex, sed lex. Hard is the law, nevertheless it is the law. But by her own blameless and happy life, as well as by her teachings, our leader has induced a multitude, how great no man can number, to become gladly obedient to law, so that they think rightly or righteously. No one can change the law of Christian metaphysics, the law of right thinking, nor in any wise alter its effects. It is a forever fact that the meek and lowly in heart are blessed and comforted by divine love. If the proud are lonely and uncomforted, it is because they have thoughts adverse to the law of love. Pride, arrogance, and self-will are unmerciful, and so receive judgment without mercy. But the law of metaphysics says, "Blessed are the merciful," and will allow no one to escape that blessedness, howsoever far he may stray, whatsoever lawlessness of hatred he may practice and suffer from. So we see that Christian Science makes no compromise with evil, sin, wrong, or imperfection, but maintains the perfect standard of truth and righteousness and joy. It teaches us to rise from sentimental affection, which admires friends and hates enemies, into brotherly love, which is just and kind to all, and unable to cherish any enmity. It brings into present and hourly application what Paul termed the law of the Spirit of life in Christ Jesus, and shows man that his real estate is one of blessedness. Why should anyone postpone his legitimate joy and disregard his lawful inheritance, which is incorruptible and undefiled? Our leader and teacher not only discovered Christian Science, but through long years of consecration has obeyed its every demand, for our sakes as well as for her own. And we begin to understand how illimitable is the love which supports such selfless devotion. We begin to comprehend the beauty of holiness, and to be truly grateful to her who has depicted its form and comeliness. We have found it true that she openeth her mouth with wisdom, and in her tongue is the law of kindness. It is my pleasure to introduce to you a faithful follower of this leader as the president for the coming year, Willis F. Gross, CSB, one who has for many years witnessed a good confession in the practice of Christian Science. You are no doubt already acquainted with him as one of the helpful contributors to our periodicals, so that any further words of mine are unnecessary. Mr. Gross, on assuming office, said, "Beloved friends, Most unexpectedly to me came the call to serve you in this capacity, and I desire to improve this opportunity to express my thanks for the honor conferred upon me. With a heart filled with gratitude for the countless blessings which have come into my life through Christian Science, I shall endeavor to perform this service to the best of my ability. It affords me great pleasure to welcome you to our first annual meeting held in the extension of the Mother Church. I shall not attempt to speak of the deep significance of this momentous occasion. I realize that only as infinite good unfolds in each individual consciousness can we begin to comprehend, even in small degree, how great is the work that has been inaugurated by our beloved leader. How faithful is her allegiance to God. How untiring are her efforts. And how successful she is in the performance of her daily tasks. With a mighty hand and with an outstretched arm were the children of Israel delivered from the bondage of the Egyptians. But this deliverance did not put them in possession of the promised land. An unknown wilderness was before them, and that wilderness must be conquered. The law was given that they might know what was required of them, that they might have a definite rule of action whereby to order aright the affairs of daily life. Obedience to the demands of the law revealed the God of their fathers, and they learned to know him. During their sojourn in the wilderness, they suffered defeats and met with disappointments, but they learned from experience and finally became willingly obedient to the voice of their leader. The crossing of the Jordan brought them into the promised land, and this experience was almost as marvelous as had been the passage of the Red Sea 40 years before. In obedience to the command of Joshua, 12 stones taken from the midst of the river were set up on the other side for a memorial. In future generations, when it was asked, "What mean ye by these stones?" it was told them, "Israel came over this Jordan on dry ground." 40 years ago, the science of Christian healing was revealed to our beloved leader, the Reverend Mary Baker Eddy. A few years later, she gave us our textbook, Science and Health with Key to the Scriptures. Obedience to the teachings of this book has brought us to this hour. We have learned from experience, and today we rejoice that we have found in Christian Science that which heals and saves. The world looks with wonder upon this grand achievement, the completion and dedication of our magnificent temple, and many are asking, "What mean ye by these stones?" The answer is, the way out of the wilderness of human beliefs has been revealed. Through the understanding of God as an ever-present help, the sick are being healed. The shackles of sin are being broken. Heavy burdens are being laid down. Tears are being wiped away. And Israel is going up to possess the promised land of eternal, harmonious existence. Friends, our progress may be fast or it may be slow, but one thing is certain: it will be sure, if we are obedient to the loving counsel of our ever-faithful leader. The Christ is here, has come to individual consciousness, and the faithful disciple rejoices in prophecy fulfilled. Lo, I am with you always, even unto the end of the world. Telegram to Mrs. Eddy. Judge Septimus J. Hanna then advanced to the front of the platform, read the following dispatch, and moved that it be forwarded at once to our leader, Mrs. Eddy. The motion was carried unanimously by a rising vote. The dispatch was as follows. To the Reverend Mary Baker Eddy, Pleasant View, Concord, New Hampshire. Beloved teacher and leader, the members of the Mother Church, the First Church of Christ Scientist in Boston, Massachusetts, in annual meeting assembled, hereby convey to you their sincere greetings and their deep love. They desire to express their continued loyalty to your teachings, their unshaken confidence in the unerring wisdom of your leadership, and their confident assurance that strict and intelligent recognition of and obedience to the comprehensive means by you provided for the furtherance of our cause will result in its perpetuity, as well as in the ultimate regeneration of its adherents and of mankind. We are witnessing with joy and gratitude the significant events associated with this, one of the greatest and most important gatherings of Christian Scientists in the annals of our history. Yet, the upwards of 30,000 who are physically present at the dedication represent only a small part of the entire body who are of us and with us in the animus and spirit of our movement. The great temple is finished. That which you have long prophetically seen has been accomplished. The magnificent edifice stands a fitting monument of your obedience and fidelity to the divine principle revealed to you in that momentous hour when purblind mortal sense declared you to be in extremis. You followed unswervingly the guidance of him who went before you by day in a pillar of cloud, to lead you in the way, and by night in a pillar of fire to give you light. And the results of such following have been marvelous beyond human ken. As clearly as in retrospect we see the earlier leading, we now discern the fulfillment of the later prophecy, that he took not away the pillar of cloud by day, nor the pillar of fire by night. For each advancing step has logically followed the preceding one. The great temple is finished. This massive pile of New Hampshire granite and Bedford stone, rising to a height of 224 feet, 1 foot loftier than the Bunker Hill Monument, stands a material type of truth's permanence. In solid foundation, in symmetrical arches, in generous hallways, in commodious foyer and broad stairways, in exquisite and expansive auditorium, and in towering, overshadowing dome, the great structure stands, silently but eloquently beckoning us on towards a higher and more spiritual plane of living. For we know that without this spiritual significance, it were but a passing dream. In the best sense, it stands in prophetic verity of the primary declaration of this church in its original organization, namely, to organize a church designed to commemorate the word and works of our Master, which should reinstate primitive Christianity and its lost element of healing. Church Manual, page 17. To rise to the demands of this early pronouncement is the work of true Christian scientists. To preach the gospel and heal the sick on the Christ basis is the essential requirement of a reinstated Christianity. Only as we pledge ourselves anew to this demand, and then fulfill the pledge in righteous living, are we faithful, obedient, deserving disciples. On this solemn occasion, and in the presence of this assembled host, we do hereby pledge ourselves to a deeper consecration, a more sincere and Christly love of God and our brother, and a more implicit obedience to the sacred teachings of the Bible and our textbook, as well as to the all-inclusive instructions and admonitions of our church manual in its spiritual import, that we may indeed reach unto the city of the living God, the heavenly Jerusalem, and to an innumerable company of angels, to the general assembly and church of the firstborn. William B. Johnson, Clerk, Boston, Massachusetts, June 12, 1906. Report of the Clerk. Beloved brethren of the First Church of Christ Scientist in Boston, Massachusetts, it seems meet at this time, when thousands of Christian Scientists have gathered here from all parts of the world, many of whom have not had the means of knowing the steps by which this church has reached its present growth, to present in this report a few of the stages of its progress, as gleaned from the pages of its history. After a work has been established, has grown to great magnitude, and people the world over have been touched by its influence for good, it is with joy that those who have labored unceasingly for the work look back to the picturesque, interesting, and epoch-marking stages of its growth, and recall memories of trials, progress, and victories that are precious, each and all. Today, we look back over the years that have passed since the inception of this great cause, and we cannot help being touched by each landmark of progress that showed a forward effort into the well-earned joy that is with us now. For a cause that has rooted itself in so many distant lands and inspired so many of different races and tongues into the demonstration of the knowledge of God, the years that have passed since Mrs. Eddy founded her first church seem but a short time. And this little church, God's word in the wilderness of dogma and creed, opened an era of Christian worship founded on the commands of Jesus. Go ye into all the world, and preach the gospel to every creature. And these signs shall follow them that believe. In my name shall they cast out devils. They shall speak with new tongues. They shall take up serpents. And if they drink any deadly thing, it shall not hurt them. They shall lay hands on the sick, and they shall recover. Not until 19 centuries had passed was there one ready to receive the inspiration, to restore to human consciousness the stone that had been rejected, and which Mrs. Eddy made the head of the corner of the Church of Christ Scientist. With the reading of her textbook, Science and Health with Key to the Scriptures, Mrs. Eddy insisted that her students make every day a prayerful study of the Bible and obtain the spiritual understanding of its promises. Upon this, she founded the future growth of her church, and 26 years later, the following splendid appreciation of her efforts appeared in the Methodist Review from the pen of the late Frederick Lawrence Knowles. Quote, Mrs. Eddy, in her insistence upon the constant daily reading of the Bible and her own writings, has given to her disciples a means of spiritual development which will certainly build such truth as they do gain into the marrow of their characters. The scorn of the gross and sensual, and the subordination of merely material to spiritual values, together with the discouragement of care and worry, are all forces that make for righteousness, and they are burned indelibly upon the mind of the neophyte every day through its reading. The intellects of these people are not drugged by scandal, drowned in frivolity, or paralyzed by sentimental fiction. They feed the higher nature through the mind, and I am bound as an observer of them to say, in all fairness, that the result is already manifest in their faces, their conversation, and their bearing, both in public and private. What wonder that when these smiling people say, "Come thou with us, and we will do thee good," the hitherto half-persuaded one is wholly drawn over, as by an irresistible attraction. The religious body which can direct and control in no arbitrary sense, but through sane counsel, the reading of its membership, stands a great chance of sweeping the world within a generation. End quote. The charter of this little church was obtained August 23, 1879, and in the same month the members extended a unanimous invitation to Mrs. Eddy to become its pastor. At a meeting of those who were interested in forming the church, Mrs. Eddy was appointed on the committee to formulate the rules and bylaws, also the tenets and church covenant. The first business meeting of the church was held August 16, 1879, in Charlestown, Massachusetts, for the purpose of electing officers. August 22, the clerk, by instructions received at the previous meeting, sent an invitation to Mrs. Eddy to become pastor of the church. August 27, the church held a meeting, with Mrs. Eddy in the chair. An interesting record of this meeting reads, quote, "The minutes of the previous meeting were read and approved. Then Mrs. Eddy proceeded to instruct those present as to their duties in the Church of Christ, giving some useful hints as to the mode of conducting the church." End quote. At a meeting held October 19, 1879, it was unanimously voted that Dr. and Mrs. Eddy merited the thanks of the Society for their devoted labors in the cause of truth, and at the annual meeting, December 1 of the same year, it was voted to instruct the clerk to call Mrs. Eddy to the pastorate of the church. And at this meeting, Mrs. Eddy accepted the call. The first meeting of this little church for deliberation before a communion Sabbath was held at the home of the pastor, Mrs. Eddy, January 2, 1880. Most of those present had left their former church homes, in which they had labored faithfully and ardently, and had united themselves into a little band of prayerful workers. As the pilgrims felt the strangeness of their new home, the vast gloom of the mysterious forests, and knew not the trials before them, so this little band of pioneers, guided by their dauntless leader and teacher, starting out on their labors against the currents of dogma, creed, sickness, and sin, must have felt a peculiar sense of isolation. For their records state, quote, "The tone of this meeting for deliberation before the communion Sabbath was rather sorrowful," end quote. But as they turned steadfastly from the mortal side and looked towards the spiritual, as the records further relate, quote, "Yet there was a feeling of trust in the great Father, of love prevailing over the apparently discouraging outlook of the Church of Christ," end quote. The Communion Sunday, however, brought fresh courage to the earnest band, and the records contain these simple but suggestive words, quote, "Sunday, January 4, 1880, the church celebrated her Communion Sabbath as a church, and it was a very inspiring season to us all, and 2 new members were added to the church," end quote. This was indeed the little church in the wilderness, and few knew of its teachings. But those few saw the grandeur of its work and were willing to labor for the cause. The record of May 23, 1880, more than 26 years ago, states, quote, "Our pastor, Mrs. Eddy, preached her farewell sermon to the church. The business committee met after the services to call a general meeting of the church to devise means to pay our pastor, so as to keep her with us, as there is no one in the world who could take her place in teaching us the science of life," end quote. May 26 of the same year, the following resolutions were passed, quote, "That the members of the Church of Christ and all others now interested in said church do most sincerely regret that our pastor, Mrs. Eddy, feels it her duty to tender her resignation, and while we feel that she has not met with the support that she should have reason to expect, we venture to hope she will remain with us. That it would be a serious blow to her cause to have the public services discontinued at a time when there is such an interest manifested on the part of the people, and we know of no one who is so able as she to lead us to the higher understanding of Christianity, whereby to heal the sick and reform the sinner. It was moved to instruct the clerk to have our pastor remain with us for a few Sundays, if not permanently," end quote. At a meeting of the church December 15, 1880, an invitation was extended to Mrs. Eddy to accept the pastorate for the ensuing year, but as the records state, quote, she gave no definite answer, believing that it was for the interest of the cause and her duty to go into new fields to teach and preach. End quote. An interesting record relative to this very early work of the Church and its appreciation of Mrs. Eddy's tireless labors is that of July 20, 1881, which reads, quote, that we, the members of the Church of Christ Scientist, tender to our beloved pastor, Mrs. Eddy, the heartfelt thanks and gratitude shared by all who have attended the services, in appreciation of her earnest endeavors, her arduous labors, and successful instructions to heal the sick and reform the sinner by metaphysical truth or Christian science during the past year. Resolved, that while she had many obstacles to overcome, many mental hardships to endure, she has borne them bravely, blessing them that curse her, loving them that despitefully use her, thereby giving in her Christian example, as well as her instructions, the highest type of womanhood, or the love that heals. And while we sincerely acknowledge our indebtedness to her and to God for these blessings, we, each and all, will make greater efforts more faithfully to sustain her in her work. Resolved, that while we realize the rapid growth and welcome the fact of the spreading worldwide of this great truth, that mind, truth, life, and love, as taught and expressed by our pastor, does heal the sick, and when understood, does bring out the perfection of all things, we also realize we must use more energy and unselfish labor to establish these our Master's commands and our pastor's teachings, namely, heal the sick and preach the gospel and love our neighbor as ourselves. End quote. "18 years ago, the Reverend James Henry Whitcomb, who was not a Christian Scientist, wrote as follows, quote, whatever is to be Mrs. Eddy's future reputation, time will show. Little cares she, if only through her work truth may be glorified. More than once in her earnestness, she has reached her bottom dollar, but the interest of the world to hear her word has always filled her coffers anew. Within a few months she has made sacrifices from which most authors would have shrunk, to ensure the moral rightness of her book." End quote. This statement, fair play, the nom de plume of the Reverend James Henry Whitcomb, makes out of his own peculiar knowledge of the circumstances. Quote, day after day flew by, and weeks lengthened into months. From every quarter came important missives of inquiry and mercantile reproach. Hundreds of dollars were sunk into the bottomless sea of corrections. Yet not until the authoress was satisfied that her duty was wholly done would she allow printer and binder to send forth her book to the world. End quote. This book has now reached its 400th edition, each of 1,000 copies. On September 8, 1882, it was voted that the church hold its meetings of worship in the parlors of Mrs. Eddy's home, 569 Columbus Avenue, Boston. The services were held there until November 1883, and then in the Hawthorne Rooms at number 3 Park Street, the seating capacity of which place was about 225. At a meeting October 22, 1883, the church voted to wait upon Mrs. Eddy to ascertain if she would preach for the society for $10 a Sunday, which invitation she accepted. After establishing itself as a church in the Hawthorne Room, the number of attendants steadily increased. The pulpit was supplied by Mrs. Eddy when she could give the time to preach, and by her students and by clergymen of different denominations, among whom was the Reverend A.J. Peabody, D.D., of Cambridge, Massachusetts. The annual report of the Business Committee of the Church for the year ending December 7, 1885, contains some very interesting statements, among which is this, quote, "There was a steadily increasing interest in Christian Science among the people, even though the continuity of thought must have been very much broken by having so many different ones address them on the subject. When our pastor preached for us, it was found that the Hawthorne Rooms were inadequate for the occasion, hundreds going away who could not obtain entrance, those present enduring the inconvenience that comes from crowding, for the sake of the eternal truth she taught them." End quote. The Boston Traveler contained the following item, quote, "The Church of Christ Scientist had their meeting Easter Sunday at Hawthorne Rooms, which were crowded 1 hour before the service commenced, and half an hour before the arrival of the pastor, the Reverend Mary Baker Eddy. The tide of men and women was turned from the door with the information, 'No more standing room.'" End quote. On February 8, 1885, communion was held at Oddfellows Hall, and there were present about 800 people. At this time, the Hawthorne Rooms, which had been regarded as the church home, were outgrown. During the summer vacation, different places were considered, but no place suitable could be found that was available, and the Sunday services were postponed. There was an expectation that some place would be obtained, but the desire for services was so great that the Hawthorne Rooms were again secured. A record of this period reads, quote, "It should be here stated that from the 1st of September to our opening, crowds had besieged the doors at the Hawthorne Rooms, Sunday after Sunday." End quote. On October 18, 1885, the rooms were opened and a larger congregation was present. It was then concluded to engage Chickering Hall on Tremont Street. In the previous consideration of places for meeting, it had been decided that this hall was too large, as it seated 464. The first Sunday service held in Chickering Hall was on October 25, 1885. Mrs. Eddy preached at this service, and the hall was crowded. This date is memorable as the one upon which the Sunday school was formed. Meanwhile, it was felt that the church needed a place of its own, and efforts were made to obtain by purchase some building or church in a suitable location. Several places were considered, but were not satisfactory. Yet the thought of obtaining a church edifice, although given up for a time, was not forgotten. In the meantime, not only was the attendance rapidly growing in this church in Chickering Hall, but the cause itself was spreading over the land. September 1, 1892, Mrs. Eddy gave the plot of ground on which the Mother Church now stands. On the 23rd day of September, 1892, 12 of the members of the church met, and upon Mrs. Eddy's counsel, reorganized the church, and named it the First Church of Christ Scientist. This effort of Mrs. Eddy was an inspiration to Christian Scientists, and plans were made for a church home. In the meantime, Sunday services were held in Chickering Hall and continued there until March 1894, and during the last year the hall was crowded to overflowing. In March, however, the church was obliged to seek other quarters, as Chickering Hall was to be remodeled. At this time, the church removed to Copley Hall on Clarendon Street, which had a seating capacity of 625. And in that place, Sunday services were held until the Mother Church edifice was ready for occupancy, December 30, 1894. During the months that the congregation worshipped in Copley Hall, there was a steady increase in attendance. 12 years ago, the 21st of last month, the cornerstone of the Mother Church edifice was laid, and at that time it was thought the seating capacity would be adequate for years to come. Attendance at the Sunday service gradually increased until every seat was filled and many stood in the aisles. And in consequence, 2 services were held, morning and afternoon, the latter a repetition of the morning service. The date of the inauguration of 2 Sunday services was April 26, 1896. It was soon evident that even this provision was inadequate to meet the need, and it was found necessary to organize branch churches in such suburbs of Boston as would relieve the overcrowded condition of the Mother Church. Therefore, 3 branch churches were organized, one in each of the following named places: Cambridge, Chelsea, and Roxbury. For a while, it seemed that there would be ample room for growth of attendance in the Mother Church. But notwithstanding the relief that the organization of branch churches had given, the number of attendants increased faster than ever. From the time that the 3 foregoing named churches were established, the membership and the attendance at them and at the Mother Church steadily grew, and more branch churches were established in other suburbs, members of which had formerly been attendants at the Mother Church. In the spring of 1905, the overcrowded condition of the morning service showed that still further provision must be made, as many were obliged to leave the church for the reason that there was not even standing room. Therefore, beginning October 1, 1905, 3 services were held each Sunday, the second and third being repetitions of the first service. This continued growth, this continued overcrowding, proved the need of a larger edifice. Our communion services and annual meetings were overcrowded in the Mother Church. They were overcrowded in Tremont Temple, in Symphony Hall, and in the Mechanics Building. And the need was felt of an auditorium that would be of great seating capacity, and one that would have the sacred atmosphere of a church home. In Mrs. Eddy's message to the church in 1902, she suggested the need of a larger church edifice. And at the annual meeting of the same year, the church voted to raise any part of $2 million for the purpose of building a suitable edifice. The labor of clearing the land was begun in October 1903, and the cornerstone was laid July 16, 1904. The first annual meeting of the church was held in Chickering Hall, October 3, 1893, and the membership at that date was 1,545. The membership of this church today is 40,011. The number of candidates admitted June 5 of this year is the largest in the history of the church and numbers 4,889, which is 2,194 more than the hitherto largest admission, that of June 1903. The total number admitted during the last year is 6,181. The total number of branch churches advertised in the Christian Science Journal of this June is 682, 614 of which show a membership of 41,944. The number of societies advertised in the journal is 267. Shortly before the dedication of the Mother Church in 1895, the Boston Evening Transcript said, quote, "Wonders will never cease. Here is a church whose treasurer has sent out word that no sums except those already subscribed can be received. The Christian Scientists have a faith of the mustard seed variety. What a pity some of our practical Christian folk have not a faith approximate to that of these impractical Christian Scientists." End quote. The fact that a notice was published in the Christian Science Sentinel of last Saturday that no more funds are needed to complete the extension of the Mother Church proves the truth of this axiom: history repeats itself. These are the evidences of the magnificent growth of this cause, and are sufficient refutation of the statements that have been made that Christian Science is dying out. The majesty and the dignity of this church edifice not only shows the growth of this cause, but proclaims the trust, the willingness of those who have contributed to the erection of these mighty walls. This magnificent structure, this fitting testimonial in stone, speaks more than words can picture of the love and gratitude of a great multitude that has been healed and purified through the labor and sacrifice of our revered leader and teacher, Mary Baker Eddy, the one through whom God has revealed a demonstrable way of salvation. May her example inspire us to follow her in preaching, "The kingdom of heaven is at hand," by healing the sick and reforming the sinful, and, as she has done, verifying Jesus' words, "Lo, I am with you always." Letters and Editorial. Mrs. Mary Baker Eddy, Pleasant View, Concord, New Hampshire. My dear teacher, of the many thousands who attended the dedicatory services at the Christian Science Church last Sunday, it is doubtful if there was one so deeply impressed with the grandeur and magnitude of your work, as was the writer, whom you will recall as a member of your first class in Lynn, Massachusetts, nearly 40 years ago. When you told us that the truth you expounded was the little leaven that should leaven the whole lump, we thought this might be true in some far distant day, beyond our mortal vision. It was above conception that in less than 40 years, a new system of faith and worship, as well as of healing, should number its adherents by the hundreds of thousands, and its tenets be accepted wholly or in part by nearly every religious and scientific body in the civilized world. Seated in the gallery of that magnificent temple, which has been reared by you, gazing across the sea of heads, listening again to your words explaining the Scriptures, my mind was carried back to that first public meeting in the little hall on Market Street, Lynn, where you preached to a handful of people that would scarce fill a couple of pews in this grand amphitheater. And as I heard the sonorous tones of the powerful organ and the mighty chorus of 5,000 voices, I thought of the little melodeon on which my wife played, and of my own feeble attempts to lead the singing. In years gone by, I have been asked, did Mrs. Eddy really write Science and Health? Some say she did not. My answer has invariably been, send those who say she did not to me. I heard her talk it before it was ever written. I read it in manuscript before it was ever printed. Now my testimony is not needed. No human being in this generation has accomplished such a work or been so thoroughly endorsed or so completely vindicated. It is marvelous beyond all imagining to one who knew of your early struggles. I have been solicited by many of your followers to say something about the early history of Christian Science. I have replied that if Mrs. Eddy thought it wise to instruct them on the subject, she would doubtless do so. Possibly you may remember the words of my uncle, the good old deacon of the First Congregational Church of Lynn, when told that I had studied with you. Quote, "My boy, you will be ruined for life. It is the work of the devil." End quote. He only expressed the thought of all the Christian people at that time. What a change in the Christian world! The stone which the builders rejected has become the cornerstone of this wonderful temple of wisdom, truth, and love. Science and Health, page 495. I have yet the little Bible which you gave me as a reward for the best paper on the spiritual significance of the first chapter of Genesis. It has this inscription on the flyleaf in your handwriting, quote, "With all thy getting, get understanding," end quote. Respectfully and faithfully yours, S. P. Bancroft, Cambridge, Massachusetts, June 12, 1906. Mrs. Mary Baker Eddy, Pleasant View, Concord, New Hampshire. Dear leader and guide, now that the great event, the dedication of our new church building, is over, may I ask a little of your time to tell you of the interesting part I had to perform in this wonderful consummation. On the 25th of last March, I was asked by one of the directors if I would care to do a little watching at the church. I gladly answered in the affirmative, and have been in the building part of every night since that time. To watch the transformation has been very interesting indeed, and the lessons I have learned of the power of divine mind to remove human obstructions has been very precious. At first I thought that, since it seemed impossible for the building to be completed before the end of summer, the communion would likely be postponed until that time. Then came the announcement that the services would be held in the new extension on June 10. I saw at once that somebody had to wake up. I fought hard with the evidence of mortal sense for a time, but after a while, in the night, as I was climbing over stones and planks and plaster, I raised my eyes, and the conviction that the work would be accomplished came to me so clearly, I said aloud, "Why, there is no fear. This house will be ready for the service June 10. I bowed my head before the might of divine love, and never more did I have any doubt. One feature about the work interested me. I noticed that as soon as the workmen began to admit that the work could be done, everything seemed to move as by magic. The human mind was giving its consent. This taught me that I should be willing to let God work. I have often stood under the great dome in the dark stillness of the night and thought, what cannot God do? Science and Health, page 135. As I discovered the many intricate problems which must necessarily present themselves in such an immense undertaking, I appreciated as never before the faithful, earnest work of our noble board of directors. With unflinching faith and unfailing fidelity, they have stood at the breastworks in the battle and won the reward, "Well done, good and faithful servant. Enter thou into the joy of thy Lord." But what of this magnificent structure? Whence did it come? To me, it is the result of the love that trembled in one human heart when it whispered, "Dear God, may I not take this precious truth and give it to my brothers and sisters?" How can we ever thank God enough for such an one? Ever thank you enough for your unselfed love? May the glory which crowns the completion of this structure shed its brightest beams on your pathway and fill your heart with the joy of love's victory. Your sincere follower, James J. Rome, Boston, Massachusetts, June 30, 1906. Reverend Mary Baker Eddy, Pleasant View, Concord, New Hampshire. Beloved leader and teacher, we, the directors of your church, send you loving greetings and congratulations upon the completion of the magnificent extension of the Mother Church of Christ Scientist. And we again express our thankful appreciation of your wise counsel, timely instruction, and words of encouragement when they were so much needed. We acknowledge with many thanks the valuable services rendered to this board by the members of the business committee, who were ever ready to assist us in every way possible. Also, the services of other members of the church, who gave freely of their time and efforts when there was urgent need of both. We do not forget that it was through you we were able to secure the services of Mr. Whitcomb as builder in the early days of the construction of the church, and of Mr. Beeman in an advisory capacity in the later days. For this and for their valuable services we are grateful. Lovingly and gratefully your students, the Christian Science Board of Directors, by William B. Johnson, Secretary. Boston, Massachusetts, July 10, 1906. Editorial in Christian Science Sentinel, June 23, 1906. Our annual communion and the dedication of the extension of the Mother Church are over, and this happy and holy experience has become a part of our expanding consciousness of truth, to abide with us and enable us better to work out the purposes of divine love. It was scarcely possible to repress a feeling of exaltation as friend met friend at every turn with words of rejoicing. And even the greetings and congratulations of those not of our faith seemed to say that all the world was in some degree sharing in our joy. But within our sacred edifice there came a deeper feeling, a feeling of awe and of reverence beyond words, a new sense of the magnitude of Christian Science, this revelation of divinity which has come to the present age. Grandly does our temple symbolize this revelation in its purity, stateliness, and vastness. But even more impressive than this was the presence of the thousands who had come, as the Master predicted, from the east and from the west, and from the north and from the south, to tell by their presence that they had been healed by Christ's truth and had found the kingdom of God. As one thought upon the significance of the occasion, the achievements of our beloved leader and her relation to the experiences of the hour took on a larger and truer meaning. The glories of the realm of infinite mind, revealed to us through her spiritual attainments and her years of toil, encompassed us, and hearts were thrilled with tender gratitude and love for all that she has done. If today we feel a pardonable pride in being known as Christian Scientists, it is because our leader has made the name an honored one before the world. In her dedicatory message to the Mother Church, Mrs. Eddy says, "The first commandment of the Hebrew Decalogue, 'Thou shalt have no other gods before me,' and the Golden Rule are the all-in-all of Christian Science." In all her writings, through all the years of her leadership, she has been teaching her followers, both by precept and example, how to obey this commandment and rule. And her success in so doing is what constitutes the high standing of Christian Science before the world. Fearlessly does she warn all her followers against the indulgence of the sins which would prevent the realization of ideal manhood, the reign of the Christ. And now it is ours to address ourselves with renewed faith and love to the high and holy task of overcoming all that is unlike God, and thus prove our worthiness to be living stones in the universal temple of spirit, and worthy members of the Mother Church before men.